enlever les masques. Hein. On se reverra calmement après. Bon, par contre, on va commencer là. On fait 3, 2, 1. Tu gères les appels et quand tu mets sur le vidéo, tu le mets. Par contre, il faut que tu le mettes sur la bonne feuille pour que juste je. Eh ben, Angela et Seb, on vous assoit. Allez, 3, 2, 1, go.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être ici pour parler de compétitivité et puis du rôle de l'Union européenne et des attentes envers l'Union européenne dans la sortie de crise. Donc, je suis Victorien Blondeau, chargé d'affaires européennes à BPI France. Je vais avoir le plaisir donc d'introduire cet atelier et surtout on aura deux intervenants aujourd'hui avec nous. Tout d'abord, on aura présence, si j'ose dire, de Reinide Vögelers, qui est professeur à l'Université catholique de Louvain en Belgique, qui est également chargé de recherche au sein du think tank Bruegel. Donc, dans son métier, elle est amenée à conseiller la Commission européenne et puis le ministère flamand de l'innovation sur des sujets, des thématiques telles que l'industrie, le commerce international, les chaînes de valeur. Et puis également en présentiel cette fois, donc Antoine Ochana qui est...
Bonjour.
Bonjour Antoine, qui est chargé de développement export à BPI France Assurance Export. Donc lui, dans son métier au quotidien, il conseille le Trésor, le ministère de l'économie français, dans les négociations à l'international et aussi au niveau européen en matière de financement, de soutien public à l'export. Donc ici, aujourd'hui, nous allons échanger sur plusieurs thématiques, évidemment. Donc on va devoir s'intéresser ensemble à la transition écologique, à la digitalisation, à l'internationalisation également. Et tout ça, dans un seul but, c'est de réfléchir ensemble aux actions collectives qu'on peut envisager à l'échelle européenne en faveur de la compétitivité des entreprises. Donc évidemment, les sujets, c'est la question des chaînes de valeur, de la souveraineté économique européenne. Et donc on va échanger ensemble à ce sujet. Et donc nos intervenants, je les ai déjà présentés. Et là, tout de suite, donc, on va entendre Reinide Vögelers, qui n'a pas pu se déplacer malheureusement. On va entendre, son intervention a été préenregistrée et elle est en anglais. Bon visionnage à tous.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about industrial policy after the pandemic. My name is Reinide Vögelers. I'm a professor at the University of Leuven and also a senior fellow at Bruegel and the Peterson Institute. Talking about industrial policy after the pandemic requires that we first clearly identify the COVID crisis, which is different from past crises. That's not only because of the size of the crisis and the scope, but also of the nature of the crisis. The contagion and health effects requiring social distancing affect both the way we work, but also the way we produce, the way we communicate, the way we interact, and that has profound changes on the workings of the labor market with way more teleworking, different types of labor interactions, production processes which become more automated, value chains that have become shorter, and also sales relying more on e-commerce with different digital context between clients and suppliers. So it definitely is a substantial different supply shock than we had before, and at the same time also introduces a demand shock with different types of products and services demanded by society that can guarantee much more social distancing replacing other types of products and services. So overall, clearly important differences in terms of supply and demand. And these differences are likely to continue also post-pandemic here. So in that respect, if we're talking about recovery plans, we need to take into account that we need to adapt to a new norm. And with these changes in economy, the question is, do we also need changes in the industrial policy? Do we need more or different industrial policy than what we had before? If we think of industrial policy for a post-COVID crisis, I think we definitely have to distinguish between two different perspectives. On the one hand, there is the short-term perspective, which I would call intensive care treatment. That's avoiding the destruction of viable entities, and that's where, at the moment, most of the time, is still an attention is and budget is going to. So preventing this destruction and bankruptcy of viable entities. But that in itself is quite tricky too. It's not just about destruction of viable entities, avoiding this, but also avoiding keeping zombies alive for zombies companies that would not be able to survive anyway in the post-COVID environment. The reason why that's important is not just only because of public finance arguments of not wasting money on this, but also because if we keep zombies alive, we will make it much more difficult for new companies, creative companies, and viable companies to survive and to grow here. So in that respect, it's finding a good balance between destruction and creation here, and really focusing on viable entities. And these viable entities have to be considered in the longer term. So it's not just those that are sufficiently sufficient solvability ratio here, but it's also those that have the potential really to grow in this post-COVID times, which will look different than before here. And it's not only about viable entities that are currently operating, but also making sure that new companies that want to enter and wanted to enter can also have their room in post-COVID year. So avoiding that bankruptcy and avoiding keeping zombies alive, I think is particularly on the agenda for competition policy, and particularly the state aid control here, which should really take that perspective very carefully into account. But again, that means for state aid control not just only looking at short-term indicators for who is viable or not, but also a more dynamic perspective of who will be viable in the post-COVID times. And that actually means that the short-term intensive care treatment really needs to be very carefully aligned with a medium to long-term post-traumatic treatment here, which is really managing that creative destruction process here that is needed for rebuilding for a new post-COVID world. And in that more resilient recovery, I think a very important component will be digital technologies. In view of the importance of more efficient and socially distant ways of operating. So the adoption of digital technologies and business models will be very important characteristics of a resilient recovery. And so that raises the question of, do we need a revitalized or different type of digital industrial policy than we had before? Do we need to be more vigilant or even stronger in terms of more active in terms of removing barriers for digital technology adoption? Although some argue that actually the COVID crisis has also led to a much faster adoption of digital technologies, and what seemed to be previously barriers to digital technology were now much more quickly surpassed here because of the challenge of the post-COVID crisis. Yet we still need to monitor very carefully whether that catching up is really taking place, catching up with digital technologies, and particularly whether the trends that we saw pre-COVID in terms of larger inequality due to differences in adoption of digital technologies, with really big winning companies, while others were falling behind. Whether that process of growing inequality will also continue in post-COVID, where we will see that the winners will particularly be the big incumbents from the past, big tech from the past, or whether it will actually be an opportunity for catching up. So that's definitely something we need to carefully monitor, and also ensure that our digital strategies will allow for that catching up, particularly, and removing barriers for catching up here, such as to overcome these inequality tendencies that we have seen pre-crisis. Another dimension of a more sustainable recovery is that recovery should also be climate change compatible too. And that requires also, again, revisiting our green strategies. So do we need to speed up those green strategies too? Do we need to be more active in removing barriers for clean technology adoption? And very often also that clean technologies in combination with digital technologies definitely is a further challenge. And then the third dimension of a more resilient recovery is ensuring that recovery also is operative in health technologies and products, which would allow for the required therapeutics and vaccines that we would actually need in order to deal with the COVID challenge here. And that's actually something that certainly within Europe was somewhat of a neglected strategy. Certainly at the EU level, we had a lot of documents on digital strategies and green strategies here, but actually health strategies was something that we were less active, particularly at the EU level here. Coordination, at least, of these strategies here, and a coordinated strategy to ensure vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics is definitely something we need to reconsider as a more active part of these strategies. So if we look at this medium to long-term restoring, so what's important in general is to ensure that we have, particularly in these three areas of digital, green, and of health, ensure that we have the right innovation ecosystem at work for creative destruction in these areas to deliver the new supply and demand conditions for this post-COVID environment. So importance of innovation in order to drive these creative destruction process here, but at the same time also that this innovation work at a sufficiently critical scale here, and that means that policies will definitely need to be also beyond local levels, but also definitely international coordination at the EU level at least, but also, and beyond the EU, also global coordination. So what do we need in terms of that building that global innovation ecosystem? So definitely we will still need to have also the science for these new digital clean and health services and goods here. So that means ensuring that we have science feeding these innovation ecosystems, and that means considering science funding, budget constraints. We would definitely have to take into account the current difficult budget discussions here, that science funding remains part of productive government investments here, and would definitely be considered as good investments for future returns. Particularly because they have high social returns, although of course with a high risk, and may take a long time before they get these returns. And they are, as most studies show, have a high productive government investment return in the longer term. In terms of it's not just only on making sure we spend enough on science in these areas, but also how we spend them, with a mix of top-down directed to particularly targeted areas like digital, like health, and like clean here, but also sufficiently bottom up here. We have to be quite careful, although we need much more mission-oriented science funding here. In the past, we actually missed in that mission-oriented the whole health area to a large extent, and particularly like for infectious diseases. So we have to make sure that we target the right type of science areas here for that new it's not only a question of access to science funding, but also access to research infrastructure, input materials. For that, we definitely need also access to these materials at a global scale here. But perhaps even more important is access to research talents, the mobility of brains.
On va éviter quoi. On va éviter.
Science here, and that mobility of brains is definitely also a challenge in the current and hopefully not too long post-COVID environment. That's science, but of course that science also has to move then into innovations and innovations for this digital, clean and new health services and goods. In order to have that innovation machine also properly active, we need to ensure that we restore access to global markets and to skills, because those are important incentives and conditions for companies to turn new ideas into innovations here. And not only access to global markets and to skills, but also access to finance, and particularly access to risk capital for the risky young entrepreneurs. So that means that actually in terms of the type of industrial policy that we would need for the post-COVID, so with that focus on innovation and particularly the global dimension of innovation, means basically still focusing and ensuring that the framework conditions for creating these new digital, clean, healthy services and goods are there. So that's still mostly a horizontal policy agenda. Where certainly for the EU, very important framework condition will always be an open, competitive, large single market. That's still a necessary condition for industrial policy. But on top of that, beyond that horizontal condition, which is always an important complementary part of any industrial policy, there also needs to be some vertical picking of particular technologies and particularly initial emerging ecosystems. Why the focus on initial emerging systems? Because particularly those systems still have to be built, and they typically face a lot of systems failures in terms of information, in terms of coordination, that still needs to be addressed here. And that's why there is definitely a good justification for having industrial policy intervention supporting those emerging ecosystems here to ensure that they can take off and develop. This vertical picking should be always very carefully monitored in terms of which ones to pick and how long to support these here. So it's basically also a very intensive process of connecting the public and private partners, as well as the wider social society involved in connecting them in these emerging ecosystems. And I think development banks can play a very important role in selecting and connecting and providing, ensuring that the information is generated and transferred within those emerging systems. But so what also has been part of the discussion on industrial policy post-COVID is actually a call for more protectionism to protect against the trends of deglobalization that we had already seen before the COVID crisis, but are even more apparent in the current times here. And the reaction, certainly in Europe, is that if we see all this deglobalization going on and this increasing protectionism and geopolitical tensions between the EU and the US, do we need a fortress Europe with which will be able to generate much more autonomy in strategic sectors that we need, given that we've seen that we've become too much vulnerable for outside EU companies and markets for goods and services that are strategic for our European citizens. So this call for strategic autonomy or autonomy in strategic sectors is definitely much more on the policy table in the current times here. Now the question actually is, so I think nobody would argue against that we need to make sure that we have security of supply in strategic sectors. The question is, do we need more protectionism in order to guarantee that security of supply in strategic sectors? So I would argue that what we basically need is competitive European firms that can ensure long-term value capture and security of supply for the EU in critically strategic sectors. That doesn't require closing borders or protectionism. On the contrary, such strategic autonomy, I think, requires that we have strong enough companies that can guarantee to play an active role in developing value chains for securing the supply in these critical sectors here and play a pivotal role in these value chains. And these value chains need to be sufficiently flexible, so flexible in terms of technologies, because that flexibility will allow for much more adapting to bottlenecks. And the security of supply is guaranteed not by closing your borders, but by ensuring that you are enough flexible to switch to alternative technologies or modularities to supply the same services here. That will require, again, our innovation machine to generate these new modular technologies here, which definitely will have an important digital component here. So again, digital strategies in order to ensure flexibility in value chains, I think is a very important component of this strategic autonomy here. Not only value chains that are flexible, but also more diversified with more competing parts of the value chain rather than just exclusive ones here. So not more closed, on the contrary, more diversified, geographically diversified value chains. But what's even more important is that within these flexible and more diversified value chains, we have to ensure that Europe can capture the value in such chains from unique contributions that we are making in these chains and from the bargaining power we have in these chains from unique contributions. And these unique contributions will typically come from science, technology, innovation, talents, and capacity here. That's how you become strong players in such value chains. And if you have that science and technology capacity strength in chains, then you can actually engage in very open global value chain competition here. And you, in those global value chains, you can actually ensure supply of strategic goods, not only assure supply of strategic goods and services for your citizens, but also capture the value in terms of much more employment and returns for European companies and workers in these supply chains here. And so that's why, again, even within that fortress strategy, the focus should definitely be on ensuring framework conditions for building those strong innovation capacities here that will generate enough strength to play in open global value chains, rather than closing our borders for these value chains here. So this is my contribution to what I think industrial policy should look like in post-COVID, at least some ideas and suggestions here. Thanks for your attention. And if you want to raise some questions, even after this presentation and this day, feel free to send me emails on any of my email addresses that are listed here. Thanks for your attention.
Donc voilà, ça c'était la présentation de Madame Veugelers. Comme elle l'a indiqué, vous pouvez retrouver, vous pouvez la recontacter donc, à ces adresses email que vous voyez. En sachant qu'on a eu un petit détail technique, un petit problème technique, on va pouvoir mettre à votre disposition les slides sur YouTube. La vidéo sera disponible en rediffusion et donc voilà, vous pourrez accéder à sa présentation, à ces slides. Donc maintenant une session de questions-réponses avec Rémi 2 et ensuite nous passerons la parole à Antoine. Merci beaucoup.
How do you think we could make them more dynamic and really how to take into account global competition and for EU competition?
Yeah, that's a very good question here. So definitely, so in the short run, it's much more the state aid component that needs to be sufficiently vigilant in order to avoid that the wrong companies get supported here. For the medium to long term, it is of course still state aid that will be important because we did argue for also vertical targeting of particular new developing ecosystems, but it's more than just state aid. It's definitely also the other arms of competition policy, so both mergers as well as antitrust, in order to make sure that that companies are not developing dominant positions in markets here. And the way to actually avoid dominance and abuse of dominance is really by making sure that the innovation machine can properly function, such that on the one hand, of course, we don't want to kill any advantages for larger companies in order to develop new products and services here. But only in case they abuse those large scales or larger scales or redundancy to prevent innovations that would come from new companies. And so the contestability is definitely important, definitely an important component of competition and for competition policy to monitor, so such that this innovation machine can constantly renew itself. And that's why I think competition policy should really look at not just on ensuring competition from a short-term perspective and looking at static efficiencies here, but really looking at ensuring that markets are sufficiently contestable and that new innovations can come in. But that, of course, requires a much more longer time perspective, also much more taking into account technological characteristics rather than current market characteristics here, and also allowing competition policy to take a much more or much less of a verifiability condition here, so that any argument should always be verifiable, because that means in short, you can only look at short-term effects. A lot of innovation will always be very uncertain here, and these kind of effects, although they are uncertain, can still be very important to look at, and that's why competition policy should not be too much taking a legalistic perspective with verifiability conditions, but really looking at what are the potential barriers for new activities to develop. And that's why this focus on a dynamic perspective, I think, is so important in competition policy for the medium to long term.
Écoute, pour une première technique et tout.
Thank you very much for first the presentation, of course, but also for your answers. I would like to ask a question about this innovation machine you mentioned. Within this new industrial policy for the post-COVID context and post-COVID world, how could the EU ensure a better cooperation or coordination between, from one hand, the industrial companies and on the other hand, the research and innovation ecosystems?
Yeah. So this has been on the agenda of the EU already since a long time. Within the framework program, that was its main instrument. So they definitely emphasized collaboration, but that was mostly also either collaboration among science or research entities. And it also, but only recently started also to ensure that there was enough collaboration, at least between those science and research institutions and the private sector, but still very timidly in the sense that it was still in the very early phases of research and pre-development that industry was also getting on board, but still at a relatively smaller scale. And it's also more recently that there has now also been a shift towards going way more into also the innovation part itself and the commercial part of that. Although that's of course a very careful. An area that requires careful intervention. And supporting not just only innovative companies here, but particularly the collaboration, coordination in innovation networks at the EU level. So this is partly within the framework program, where collaborations also between companies in areas of where Europe hopes to get some kind of leadership was already stimulated before the crisis. And that's definitely also and will raise even more, particularly when we look at the more mission-oriented parts of the framework program for the future. But I'd like to point out a particularly important new angle, also related to these missions and challenges, which is the projects of common interest. So these are really projects aimed at installing a coordination among industrial players, particularly in emerging new ecosystems for the grand challenges. So we have the Battery Alliance as an example now, we have the hydrogen. So these are all good examples of where the EU wants to support this building of networks of ecosystems in these early phases, particularly for areas within clean, but also other areas are examined. And so the only thing actually basically that the EU does here is to allow these networks to be funded by national governments, state aid, and to preempt them from or exempt them from state aid constraints. So in that respect, it is a good coordination also between the EU and national funding in order to help these evolving ecosystems. So I think it's a good example of what the role of the EU could be here. And again, bringing on board this state aid instrument that it has. Also to monitor which kind of these common interest projects will actually be supported or not, and to ensure that the right kind of projects are picked here that do have this market failure issue where governments can actually help a lot.
Thank you very much again for your answer.
Donc,
maybe we'll do one last
petite session
question.
de questions-réponses avec René de Vogers, donc, qui est professeur à l'Université catholique de Louvain et qui travaille pour Bruegel. Un peu long, mais comme vous l'avez constaté, donc René de est vraiment au cœur de la politique européenne sur les sujets qui nous intéressent aujourd'hui en matière de compétitivité. Alors j'ai vu une question, est-ce que l'audio sera disponible? Effectivement, donc la vidéo est en même temps retransmise sur YouTube et vous la retrouverez simplement en tapant BPI France, Compétitivité et Union Européenne Big 2020 et vous pourrez trouver donc la vidéo et on va faire en sorte de rajouter les slides. Maintenant, je me tourne vers donc Antoine Ochana, qui est donc chargé de développement export pour BPI France Assurance Export et puis qui va nous parler aussi du lien de la concurrence que rencontre l'Union Européenne aujourd'hui dans le commerce mondial.
Effectivement, merci beaucoup Victorien. Donc, dans le domaine du soutien public aux exportations, nous faisons face à une forte concurrence. Alors il faut savoir que les agences de crédit d'export jouent un rôle important dans le soutien à leurs entreprises nationales. Et dans ce domaine-là, nous voyons que tous les principaux États, toutes les principales puissances ont un système de soutien aux exportations, soutien public aux exportations très important. Et nous avons fait le constat avec mes homologues européens qu'il y avait un réel besoin d'agir au niveau européen. C'est pourquoi nous avons participé, nous avons créé un forum de discussion informel, une sorte de think tank sur le financement des exportations au sens très large, pour réfléchir sur tous ces sujets-là et essayer de voir qu'est-ce que l'Union européenne pourrait faire pour faire face à la compétition internationale. Alors jusqu'à maintenant, l'Union européenne s'est essentiellement focalisée sur la réglementation de ce soutien public à travers, au niveau européen, la réglementation sur les aides d'État et au niveau international en promouvant le multilatéralisme et avec des accords au sein de l'OMC ou de l'OCDE. Aujourd'hui, on voit que ce travail-là est nécessaire pour avoir une concurrence saine au niveau international. Mais on remarque aussi que c'est insuffisant. Comme chacun peut le remarquer en regardant les informations, le multilatéralisme aujourd'hui a beaucoup de mal à avancer. Il avance difficilement et l'Union européenne a besoin de créer un rapport de force qui soit davantage en sa faveur, au risque de se retrouver relégué face à la concurrence mondiale. Donc c'est pour cette raison que nous pensons qu'il faut revoir un certain nombre de choses et avant tout définir une réelle stratégie européenne dans l'objectif précis de soutenir la compétitivité de nos entreprises. Et cela pourrait passer par différentes formes qu'il faudrait sans doute discuter davantage. Et on va continuer tout ce travail-là avec nos homologues européens et les ministères compétents en la matière pour peut-être définir un intérêt européen dans lequel il y aurait matière à agir au niveau européen et aussi favoriser la coopération entre institutions, nationales avec les autres agences de crédit d'export, mais aussi les autres acteurs de la finance des exportations. Je pense notamment aux agences de développement qui, si elles poursuivent un but différent, agissent sur les mêmes domaines, sur les mêmes opérations. Et également avec peut-être des institutions aussi, des banques multilatérales pour tout simplement aider au mieux nos entreprises. Parce que ce que nous remarquons, c'est que les États étrangers ont déjà enclenché ce mouvement de coopération à leur niveau national et l'Union européenne a besoin d'agir aussi à ce niveau-là. Et donc voilà à peu près les principales mesures qu'il faudrait prendre au niveau européen, définir une stratégie et renforcer la coopération entre nos institutions nationales et internationales. Et aussi un élément qu'on pourrait rajouter, c'est continuer à défendre le multilatéralisme et notamment pour avoir des règles appropriées pour mieux soutenir aussi la transition énergétique et la lutte contre le changement climatique.
Merci beaucoup Antoine. Il nous reste 2 minutes. S'il y a des questions dans l'audience ou sur l'application, on va les prendre en tout cas pour Antoine. Si vous avez des questions aussi à adresser à Madame Fuglers, donc vous pouvez les envoyer à ses adresses email. Je vais me retourner pour les lire. Donc reinhilde.vugelers@kuleuven.be et également reinhilde.vugelers@bruegel.org. Alors moi j'ai une première question pour Antoine. Vous avez mentionné donc des recommandations des agences de crédit export. Quand est-ce qu'on pourrait les lire?
C'est une très bonne question. Alors ça a été un peu retardé à cause du Covid. Nous espérons communiquer à différentes instances compétentes, des instances politiques en charge de ces questions-là d'ici la fin de l'année.
Parfait. Donc j'ai regardé sur l'application, il n'y avait pas d'autres questions, il n'y en a pas visiblement dans les d'histoire. En tout cas, nos intervenants se tiennent à votre disposition par email et puis vous pouvez retrouver donc notre atelier sur YouTube. Voilà, donc merci beaucoup Antoine.
Merci Victorien.
Merci à toutes et à tous et bon après-midi.